this tragic ending. It's pre-written. And I talked to a friend of mine who is a writer, and she said, "You're a fiction writer. Make it happy. Give it a happy ending," which was something I had forgotten, right? Because the archives are about, like, where I found my information was in criminal records and police, criminal, court transcripts and police records. Like, that's where I was finding how people actually lived as opposed to how they were supposed to live. And just having that freedom to be a fiction writer and be like, screw it. He's going to find true love and he's going to be happy and, get some money. That's...
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
What are the buried Black histories that you sought to excavate through your novels? And why do you think it's important for Canadians to know about the specific history that your book tackles? And that's a question for everybody. Anybody can start.
Well, since people are looking at me, I'll start. It's so good to see everyone here, so thanks all of you for coming. I think I'm not a historian, and I wouldn't frame my book as a Black history necessarily. So a lot of the history that's revealed in the book comes through my main character Cyril's work, and Cyril is certainly not a historian. He's an amateur sleuth looking for evidence of someone who was born in the 20s. But along the way, he learns quite a bit, or a certain amount about Black history, particularly in Toronto, but also across the country to some degree. And then my second character, Edward, is the man born in the 20s, and it's a look too at his life. So a lot of the history he lives is not necessarily Black history, but it's a Black man inside that Canadian history.
Suzette?
Yeah, so I think I'll approach it a bit differently, so my book, The Sleeping Car Porter, is set in 1929. It's about a sleeping car porter named Baxter who travels from Montreal to Vancouver in a single trip and gets stuck in the Rocky Mountains. And the other element of the book is that he is a closeted gay man. And what I was longing for was that I found that a lot of Black history tends to be Central Canadian Black history or maritime Black history. And what I was looking for was a Western queer Black history. Because in the West, certainly in Alberta, I mean, when you talk about the Black population, it's, there are some communities like Amber Valley, there's another community as well, who were made up of farmers who immigrated from Oklahoma and Texas in the early 1900s to escape the racist violence there. And that was kind of all we ever heard about was, if we were lucky, was John Ware, who was this mythological Black cowboy. And I am so not a cowboy, and so I was just desperate or not desperate, but I was really I knew Black people were doing other things, that it wasn't just about farming, and so I had a former mentor who told me about the sleeping car porters, and I thought, this is really important history I didn't learn about when I was a kid. It's coming out more and more, I find, with the work that people have been doing in the CBC show. But what does that have to do with me? And what does Black Canadian history have to do with me as a Black Canadian and as a queer Canadian? So it was also about kind of excavating queer history in Canada. So this book is the book I wanted to find that I could not find. That was not about farming. It's about dentists. So, yeah.
Amazing. I resonate with how you opened us off because similar to you, I feel what I remember from my schooling was like a brief chapter on the Underground Railroad. I remember we read this book by Barbara Smucker called Underground to Canada, which is a really interesting book. I don't really have a critique of the book, but that was like the only time that black people were presented to me as a kid growing up in the Canadian school system. And it is interesting because Canada doesn't really appear in that book. It's like the story of these enslaved children, and they escape and they end up in Canada, and it's like, oh, freedom, the promised land. And I think what I began to realize was that this is a narrative of the Underground Railroad that was very much meant to serve kind of a white liberal agenda in terms of how to position Canada in relationship to the US, but just, you know, it was a national mythology, I guess, of a story that wasn't really about Canada at all. And it was drawing on this chapter of history, which was quite brief in the scope of even the history of the Underground Railroad itself. You know, the period of time was about 10 years, you know, where Canada was the destination of the Underground Railroad. And so in terms of the history that I was trying to excavate in researching this book, it was number one, what did happen when people fleeing enslavement got to Canada? What did their lives look like? What were the things that they struggled against? What were the triumphs that they experienced? And then to go deeper, you know, what did this period preceding that of the Underground Railroad in Canada, or that period in which Canada was the destination of the Underground Railroad, during which there were over 2 centuries of race-based enslavement, which subjugated black as well as indigenous people here. So what did that look like, and how did that shape the landscape here? So those were the 2 kind of questions that I used to guide the research for my novel.
And then may I just add one more thing, because I think I sold the book short a little bit there, but Toronto has, or Canada has, does have a whole history of black accomplishment, but it's disguised and camouflaged, and it's called something else, and it's not named. It's not named black, or, you know, it's not racialized accomplishment. And that was something I really did want to pull out of the book.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how much our writing is a reflection of how we think and feel in our own experiences. I think as people who identify as black in Canada, the things that we care about, the things that we've struggled with. And I did want to ask, how much of yourself was challenged in the writing of your books? And again, this is for everybody. Your personal experiences, your interests, your identity, how you see how you identify, your struggles on an institutional level and on a personal level. You know, how much of that appears in your historical characters, in your conflict, in the history that you're trying to excavate? And what is it like to have that connection to your characters and to your book? Because I often tell, you know, I teach creative writing at Lakehead University. I often tell my students that writing is a psychological and emotional battle as much as anything else. So anybody can start.
I'll start off. So I found that when I first started writing about sleeping car porters, or a sleeping car porter, it was very hard to access the character, because it was, you know, I had to jump in time, I had to jump into another gender, there were so many leaps, there were geographical leaps, and it wasn't actually until I started thinking about, so what would happen if I lived in 1929, and you know, the only job I could get, or the best job I could get, was as a sleeping car porter. What would I be interested in? And so, you know, just trying to inhabit that body and understand that history, and I know everybody knows this, but I didn't know this. History doesn't happen in black and white. Mm-hmm. and in silent film, it's alive. And if I could go in a time machine, it would be the same colors. There would be sounds, there would be smells, there would be all kinds of things. And so it was only after kind of teleporting myself into that body and thinking about what are my desires, so as a queer person, but also what are my interests. I'm interested in horror literature. I'm interested in certain kinds of speculative literature. So what would I have had access to? Well, I would have had access to, Dracula and Frankenstein. And so that's what I would be reading. And so that's how I kind of started out with the character. And I totally understand what you're talking about with creative writing classes, because what I don't want is to put myself on the page, but I can certainly start with myself or people I know or my life as scaffolding, start filling it in, and then that scaffolding falls away and the character becomes themselves, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, I think all of the above, right? And so I think what we bring to writing, if it's working for us, is deep empathy,
Yes.
and so. And for me, it was about writing those characters, and again, writing across gender. And I was writing about a much younger person than me, and a rather older person than me, and so in the sort of creating of the character, in learning, sort of going deeper. And I really do feel it's the going deeper. That suddenly starts to feel like, this person I can understand I know exactly what they would do in this situation.
Yeah, I think for me, it really speaks to this core tension, at the heart of creative writing. For me, is like how to inhabit a character while still getting out of the way. And I love the way that you framed it, Suzette, in terms of the scaffolding. Like, that imagery makes a lot of sense. And for me, it was also, like, the other metaphor that kind of comes up is, how to have conversations with these characters that I'm inventing. And that was a real benchmark in terms of recognizing when the character is able to stand on their own 2 feet. And in terms of how that challenged me as a writer, I think it's that getting out of the way piece of really allowing characters who have a completely different set of experiences from my own, and yet characters who I've birthed in a way, letting them have their own space, make their own choices that might break my heart or might be different from what I would have liked to have happened had I known these people, or had I had a personal relationship with them in their time. So yeah, I think it's that is the challenge for me, is how to give these characters the space to have their experiences, and then also to respect when there's something they don't want to tell me. To respect what the story. I mean, in my case, it's almost completely in the first person. So this was something that I thought about, was how to respect their voice and the stories that they wanted to tell, and it wasn't just all about the stories that I wanted to tell. So yeah, just those complex conversations, Yeah.
I like that you use the word respect, because that's something that I've often been thinking about. My own book, The Queen's Spade, it's a historical revenge thriller about Sarah Forbes-Bonetta, who was the adopted African daughter of Queen Victoria. I don't know, did anybody know that Queen Victoria in the 19th century had an adopted African daughter? Once I knew that there was a Nigerian British princess, I was like, I need to, from my tribe, right, Yoruba. So I was like, okay, I gotta learn more about this person. And I realized that in terms of research, a lot of what was talked about, there was a lot of things written about Sarah Forbes-Bonetta by typically British white newspapers, the captain that took her and gave her as a gift to Queen Victoria, letters by Queen Victoria herself, but not the actual person. So I've been thinking about this idea of respect and responsibility when it comes to writing the other, so to speak, in history. And the other, oftentimes, I mean, when we think about Edward Said's definition, the other is typically, he meant it in, he used the term Orientalism. Oftentimes, people who have been colonized have been seen as the other, right? As compared to a white, a white, non-racialized subject. But even if you're writing a Black Canadian, you're still writing the other in a way, because this is a person who has had experiences that you have never had. This is a person who has lived in a history that we can only imagine and research, but we don't live in. So what is your responsibility as a writer to write a character who is other in many ways to you? And how did you approach that responsibility?
I could start off there. I mean, I did feel that responsibility tremendously writing this book. So much of it is outside of my experience, but I think ultimately it really is, again, about character, about understanding. I mean, we're all essentially this. I'm not going to say it sounds trite, but we are all the same in as much as we have all of the bits and pieces that motivate us and frighten us or give us joy. And so that's what I needed to find, and I did have, you must have, I think, tremendous respect for everybody, actually, all of the characters who show up in the book. Even if you don't like them, you got to respect that they are. So I think that's how I was able to do it. But it seemed like a big task. And then the other piece of it was being certain that what I was writing was true, and as much as I could anchor it in a truth through research, that was very important to me.
How much is fact and how much is fiction?
Yeah.
What's the balance? Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say I didn't necessarily consider the characters I was writing to be the other in that sense, but I know it. I think what I connect with in what you're saying is this idea that so many of our ancestors haven't had a voice in history that has been recorded, that has been valorized, and to me, that is what drew me to this project of writing a fiction, because I feel like historical fiction, because I feel that it's such a powerful way to read between the lines of history. And I may not, so the only documents I may have to write about a 19th century, 18th century enslaved Black Canadian may be a runaway slave ad. And so how do I read between the lines of that ad? How do I read between the lines of documents like that haven't given these people a voice, and do as much homework as I can in terms of understanding the history, understanding and examining the documents that do exist, and then letting spirit guide the rest, I guess, and the creative process guide the rest. So it is a fine balance, and for me the kind of guiding principle was just do as much homework as I can manage, and then at a certain point, the characters will speak.
Yeah, I think I totally agree about the whole idea of, I don't think I never felt like I was writing the other. That was never my feeling. But as far as responsibility, and I think that is such an interesting term, because what I found often happened when I was doing the research for the sleeping car porters was that people projected onto them as a group because they were kind of cagey guys, right? Like they didn't talk about the actual work, or a lot of them didn't. And they protected each other in all kinds of ways, and there was sort of like a code of silence among a lot of them, I think. Not all of them, but, you know, quite a few. And what I found was that, you know, I could find two narratives. And one was the sleeping car porters are heroes, and they were essential to black labor rights in Canada, and they're amazing. And then there was this kind of seamier side, which was sleeping car porters, they're bigamists, and they play cards, and they drink a lot, and, you know, they smuggle booze. So it was sort of like one or the other, and I'm far more interested in that kind of complicated middle part. But I knew, and I also am always, you know, because I'm not a historical fiction writer, I was terrified that I'd get called out on not having correct historical details, and I just didn't want that to be a thing. And so what I felt was my responsibility was what both of you are talking about, which was to do my due diligence and to do the best I possibly could to figure out, you know, what were the correct historical details, what were, you know, because there are so many ellipses in the history, you know, I can find out this fact and I can find out that fact, but this fact is missing, and so I can make that up. But I have been really careful in making sure that I have exhausted every possible resource in order to find that information. Because, you know, I was talking to Cheryl Fogo, actually, who's a black historian in Alberta, and she writes about Amber Valley in Alberta. And she has talked about how people in the Amber Valley community get mad at her because she's not writing only good things about them. You know, so it's kind of wanting to resist that responsibility as a writer to only write good things, but to write true things, to write full people who are, you know, are good and bad and flawed, and sometimes, you know, that's the hard part, I think, and that's where the responsibility lies, which is to do that well, because, you know, there was also a stereotype for sleeping car porters, you know, when the Black Civil Rights Movement was happening, where they were seen as Uncle Toms. Like, they were not seen as, you know, heroes. That was in the beginning, and then it came later, but in the middle, not so much. So, you know, trying to negotiate who they were, who my guy was, I felt very responsible.
The different tensions between all of these contrasting narratives that aren't false, right? They're all true at the same time. It's so interesting, and actually that's a perfect segue into a question that I had for Sheila specifically, but if this rings true to anyone else and you just want to sort of answer it as well, absolutely feel free to do so. While I was reading your book, I had this question sort of pop up, because I had the opportunity to talk to Randall Adjei, who's the Toronto Poet Laureate, and he spoke to my grad students. He spoke about growth through adversity, right, for Black Canadians. Indeed, I think much of our history reflects adversity, reflects the good and the bad. And I think, you know, being a Black immigrant, right, like Cyril, coming to terms with your own personal trauma, you know, anger, the work of anger and legitimate anger, or to be honest, I don't know if there is such a thing as illegitimate anger. I think when it comes to the experiences of Black Canadians, I don't know, we can talk about that. But do you think that in writing Black Canadian historical fiction, in telling those truths, there's a risk that we might delve too deeply into the traumatic aspects? And I ask that because there's been a lot of conversation about Black stories reflecting Black trauma too much, right? And the idea that Black joy is important as well, and also the idea that Black trauma can also, it doesn't negate the existence of Black joy simultaneously. So I don't know if you had any Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, you talked about, so coming out of adversity. I mean, that's the sort of beginnings of it, right? And in that can be trauma, the experience of violence. In Cyril's case, his anger comes from a sense of abandonment by his mother and his black mother and his white father, who he really has never known. And he's real angry about that, but he doesn't even know it. He's a young guy. He hasn't even figured out that it's anger yet. What he experiences is extreme loneliness. But I think, there are the facts, right? The facts are, you can't argue with the sort of where, as a black person, where you're likely to end up because you're black versus someone who's white. And then there's a whole lot of gray in between, absolutely. But that's part of the black experience, and we have to own it. But joy comes too, and community. I mean, in Cyril's case, community is hard to find, but I think for many of us, there's a very joyful community, a sort of place to go home to. So I think it's all in there, and I think it's important to own it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any thoughts about this dichotomy, if it is, of black trauma, black pain, and black joy?
Yes. That was something I thought about a lot. Because, when I was putting the book together, or putting the character together, I thought, okay, so this is a book set in 1929. It's about a black man. It's about a closeted gay man. Nothing good can happen here, and then I thought, I talked to a friend of mine, and she said, it's like this tragic ending, it's pre-written. And I talked to a friend of mine who is a writer, and she said, you're a fiction writer. Make it happy. Give it a happy ending, which was something I had forgotten, right? Because the archives are about, where I found my information was in criminal records and police, criminal, court transcripts and police records. That's where I was finding how people actually lived as opposed to how they were supposed to live. And just having that freedom to be a fiction writer and be like, screw it. He's going to find true love and he's going to be happy and, get some money. It's like, yeah. So I deliberately inserted black joy because I was tired of those narratives a little bit. Yeah.
I love that. That that hits home. I feel like the thing that became apparent for me as I was researching was you can find anything, and anything that you're looking for in history, you'll find it. And as long as big of a project as a novel can be, it's kind of a small thing in a way too, in that it's just a few scenes, strung together, and you have to choose at some point what those scenes are going to be about. And I think it's a really pertinent conversation because there's a way in which the depiction of black trauma is it will sell, it's there's a lot of we're taught to find a kind of perverse enjoyment in watching those depictions. We're saturated with them in the news, in fiction, in TV, and it doesn't have to be that way, because those are not the only stories, those are not the only experiences that we have, those are not the only experiences that our ancestors had. And my goal in the book was to write, while acknowledging experiences of trauma, almost completely avoid depicting them. And if you read it, there'll be references, and there's no avoiding it. I didn't want to turn a blind eye to violence, But when you think about, when I thought about what are the scenes really going to be about, and what it's about, joy, power, problem solving, cooperation. Those were the scenes. Those were the, when you get into the nitty gritty and the meat of what a story is really dealing with. That's what I want to see, and that's what I wanted to write. So that's how I kind of tackled that. Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue into the specific question I had for you, because is it because of the multiplicity and the plurality of Black experiences that you felt the need to not limit your storytelling to one perspective?
Yeah, in a way, it was like, in part because I was interested in historical moments. I was interested in themes. I was interested in, Black sovereignty, Black and indigenous relationships throughout history. I was interested in these broader questions, and so saturating it with a bunch of different narrators was one way to get that scope in the novel. But honestly, I don't think I could have written it any other way also, and that may just be being a millennial. Just like constant distraction.
Yep.
So, there's different ways to think about that one.
Well, it's something that I always kind of worry about as well, right? When telling the story, how best do you tell your story? Through whose perspective does the story need to be told in? And Suzette, you have another element, I think. You mentioned horror, right? Obviously speculative, like Dracula. And you actually do use speculative elements in your work, in a way, to tell this story of outsideness, I guess. I mean, when we think about the myth of Canada, we've discussed that, right? Sort of the white liberal democracy, the myth of Canada as being kind and clean, the clean white North, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have Black people who are kind of constituted as outsiders in a way. And then you have other kinds of intersectionality as well. Black queer porters, for example. How did the use of speculative elements help you to tell that story of outsideness, I guess?
So in the sleeping car porter, are there speculative
It feels
elements?
a little bit to
That's
me.
interesting because
It felt very...
that's so interesting because this is the least. So I write a lot of magic realism and a lot of supernatural and horror, whatever, in my other books, and this is like the least. This is me at my very best trying to just not rely on magic or unicorns to save the day. And I'm surprised you picked that up because I mean there was a draft where there was a haunted compartment.
That was what I was thinking about. I don't know, like that scene screamed horror to me. I don't know. It screamed we're going into magical realism.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I guess. I mean, I suppose. I can see how you might see that. But I think it's more of like a Rorschach test, where there's a character who holds a séance, and is there a ghost or isn't there a ghost? Is there a ghost of a porter or isn't it, or is it just the main character projecting his anxieties onto a figure? So, what was your question around that? I got very. I was like, what?
Okay, well, assuming we can sort of put that within the realm of fantasy or within the realm of some kind of speculative magical realism, does that help to tell, or I guess we can say it more broadly, can those elements help to tell these kinds of stories of Blackness, of outsideness?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the reason I gravitate towards it so much is because I feel it gives whole other vocabulary in order to convey certain realities. So I have an earlier book called Venus Hum, which nobody read, so that's okay. But basically, the black people in that book are, my equation was, there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment at the time when I was writing the book, as there is now. And the equation seemed to be, okay, immigrants will take our jobs. If people take if people take our jobs, we'll have no money. If we have no money, we won't be able to eat. And if we can't eat, we will die. So immigrants equal, we will die. And so what happens in the book is that the black people are all vampires, for example. And Marie-Angelique is a reincarnated black lesbian who's really cool and hangs out downtown. Anyway, so... yeah. Well, it's called Venus Hum, but it's nobody... Anyway, whatever. So, okay. I'm apologizing ahead of time. It's one of the earlier books. So as far as this book goes, I think that So the character Baxter potentially has the sixth sense. And I think that was really valuable for me just as a device because it allowed him and it gave the reader access to these passengers whom he's serving in a way that we wouldn't have gotten before. So I think it was kind of me having a metaphorical reflection or metaphorical angle on this whole idea of porters having to, in order to survive, they had to have a kind of sixth sense. If they wanted to have good tips, they had to be able to know people better than the people knew themselves, the passengers knew themselves. And so by making that more concrete, by introducing the element of a spiritualist who can see ghosts, and who can see Baxter's ghost, then it helped me a lot. I think I'm just I find real life really tedious, and I really love the possibility that I know there's got to be something else. That's basically my philosophy. Yeah.
Well, as a Nigerian-Canadian writer, I can tell you that I feel you on not knowing, is this actually considered speculative or is it not? Because there are parts of my own Yoruba heritage that, to other people, it's completely speculative and fantasy, the things that we believe. To us, it's just normal. It's just that's just rituals and all that stuff.
That's so interesting because that's my mom. She's Caribbean, from the Bahamas, and so it's of course there are dead people.
Yeah, and that's not fantasy. It's real.
It's real life.
So, I guess that we'll have to continue that debate elsewhere at a different time. What is speculative, when, why, to whom?